Montana Territory, winter of 1879. Snow fell slow and heavy over the Bitterroot Valley, and the wind howled like a widow screaming into the sky. Owen O'Dale had not prayed in 5 years, not since the fever took his wife, Mary. He had buried her beneath the old cottonwood out back, beside the stream where she once washed their clothes and sang hymns in a soft voice. After that, the Bible stayed shut, the church pew stayed cold, and his voice stayed silent. He ran cattle, mended fences, and raised his 2 children alone on a ranch 4 miles south of Missoula. No help. No visitors. Just work and silence. The children Lydia, 9, and Luke, 6, did not remember their mother's face, only the warmth of her lap and how it felt when she held them. They watched their father work from dawn to dark, quiet and hard-eyed, speaking only when needed. They had grown used to the hush, the way grief could fill a house like smoke. That night, just days before Christmas, Owen was fixing the barn door hinge when he heard the knock. It came again, louder, and the wind carried a voice with it. "Please, hello? I need shelter." He grabbed the rifle from the wall and stepped out onto the porch. The snow was knee-deep, the wind sharp as broken glass. A figure stood near the gate, wrapped in a wool coat too thin for this kind of cold. She was holding the reins of a lathered gray mare, steam rising off its back. "Who are you?" Owen called. "My name is Kenzie Novak." The woman answered, voice shivering but clear. "My horse threw a shoe 5 miles back. I have been riding on ice since noon. Please." He looked her over. She was no outlaw. Her hands were shaking. Her lips were blue. She was young, maybe 25. And alone. He lowered the rifle. "Bring the horse inside the barn." She did, stumbling through the snow as her mare staggered behind her. Owen opened the barn door and helped her guide the animal in. His hands brushed hers cold as stone. He led the horse to a stall and tossed it fresh hay. "You can come inside the house," he said. "You look half dead." Kenzie hesitated. "I do not want to trouble you. You are already here. Might as well warm up." Inside, the children watched from behind the table, wide-eyed. Kenzie stood in the doorway dripping snow, her cheeks raw with windburn. Owen took her coat and set it by the fire. "Sit," he said. She did, hunching close to the flames. Her boots left puddles on the floor. Lydia brought her a blanket without a word. Luke stared openly. "I will need to send a wire to Missoula in the morning," she said, pulling her gloves off. "I was meant to meet my uncle there. He owns a pharmacy." Owen nodded, handed her a mug of warm water. "You can ride out with me. I go twice a week for supplies." Kenzie looked up at him then, really looked. His face was weathered, jaw dark with stubble, eyes like burnt coals, tired and watchful. "Thank you?" He shrugged. "No trouble. You need anything else?" "No. Just this fire. And maybe sleep. You can take the upstairs room. Kids are downstairs with me." She nodded, stood slowly, and followed Lydia's small hand up the creaking steps. That night, Owen sat by the fire long after the children had gone to bed. He stared at the flames, thinking of how thin her coat had been, how she had looked at him like she had not expected kindness and was startled to find it. He did not pray. But he stayed awake, listening to the wind, and thought about how long it had been since someone said thank you and meant it. The next morning, the land lay white and still under a heavy sky. Owen saddled the wagon. Kenzie came out wearing one of Mary's old coats. Lydia had found it, and insisted. "I will pay you back for the coat," Kenzie said as she climbed up beside him. "You do not owe us anything." She looked down at her gloved hands. "I was not expecting to end up here." "No one does," he said. He drove through the snow-packed trail toward Missoula. The ride was quiet at first, the only sound the crunch of wheels on frozen ground. But after a few miles, she turned to him. "You do not talk much. Nothing much left to say. What happened?" He glanced at her. Her voice was soft, not nosy, just curious. My wife died 5 winters ago. Fever. Took her in 3 days. Kenzie nodded. I lost my brother during the war. They fell into silence again. But something shifted like a window cracked open. At the post office, she sent her wire. Her uncle had not arrived in town. There was no sign of him. I do not know where to go, she said quietly as they rode back. You can stay until you figure it out. She looked at him, startled. I could not. You are not sleeping in the snow. That is final. That night, she helped Lydia and Luke with their lessons. She showed them how to fold paper stars and sang a song Owen had not heard in years, an old hymn. He stood in the corner, watching them by lamplight. The children laughed. Lydia leaned into Kenzie's side. Later, when the house was quiet, Owen stood by the fire again. The Bible still sat on the shelf, unopened. He looked at it. He did not touch it. Not yet. But he watched the flames and whispered, "Thank you?" Not to anyone in particular. Not quite a prayer. But close. Kenzie stayed for days. Then weeks. She helped in the barn, read to the children, learned how to milk the cow. She laughed louder. Smiled more. And Owen found himself watching her hands, the way she tucked her hair back, how she listened with her whole face. He found himself listening, too. One morning, she slipped on the ice beside the barn. He caught her by the waist, steadied her. You always this clumsy? He asked, eyes locked on hers. Just trying to get your attention. She teased, breath visible between them. Something passed between them, warm and bright. He let go slowly. He started praying again that night. Quiet, unsure, but real. God, he said, voice rough. I do not know what this is. But I think I want to find out. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, the fire burned steady. And upstairs, Kenzie lay awake, thinking about the way he had held her, and wondering if maybe, just maybe, she had found where she was meant to be. The thought came slow that year. By mid-January, the snow still clung to the trees like white moss, and the mornings cracked underfoot. Kenzie moved through the house like someone learning the shape of a life she hadn't expected to find. She mended hems, fed the hens, and kept close to the children as if she'd always known how to tend more than herself. One morning, Lydia came in from the yard holding a scrap of red calico she'd found caught on the fence. Miss Kenzie, she said, was this yours? Kenzie took the cloth gently. I think it came from my saddlebag. I stitched it myself when I was riding west. You so good, Lydia said. Kenzie smiled faintly. My mother taught me before she passed. She said you should always know how to patch what matters. Owen, brushing mud from his boots by the door, glanced over. You rode from Wisconsin with nothing but a bag and that gray mare? I didn't have much reason to stay, she said, folding the cloth. My brother's widow remarried. The town was full of memories and not much else. A silence settled between them as the wind thudded softly against the windows. Owen looked at her then, not with pity, but with the quiet understanding of someone who knew what it was to outlive the life he'd planned. Later that week, Owen took Luke out to check the upper pasture where the fence line often buckled under the snow. Kenzie stayed behind with Lydia, who had begun coughing in the nights. She brewed a tea from dried horehound and wild mint, whispering old remedies as if the words themselves held comfort. When Owen returned, he found Kenzie at the hearth, coaxing a low flame under the kettle, Lydia bundled beside her with a quilt tucked high under her chin. She's warm now, Kenzie said softly. I'll sit up with her tonight, keep the stove stoked. Owen set his gloves on the mantel, hands raw from cold. You don't have to. I know, she said, looking up at him. But I want to. That night, he brought in more firewood than usual, stacking it near the hearth without a word. Then he lingered by the door longer than necessary, watching the way Kenzie bent to tuck the blanket tighter around Lydia's small frame. You've got away with them, he said. Kenzie didn't look up. They make it easy. Owen sat down across from her, the fire between them painting long shadows across the room. You planning to keep heading west when the road's clear? She looked into the flames. I thought I was. Now I'm not as sure. He waited, not pressing. She turned to face him, eyes steady. You've given me more than shelter, Owen. I haven't felt safe in a long time. Not even before the storm. He nodded, feeling the weight of those words settle somewhere deep, like snow along a ridge. I didn't know I still had room for change, she said, voice barely above a whisper. But your children. You. This place. It's different. For a long time, neither spoke, just listened to the wood pop and hiss as it burned. Then Owen reached toward the mantel shelf and took down the dusty Bible. He thumbed it open, not searching, just holding it. Kenzie watched him quietly, not surprised, not asking anything. He didn't read aloud. Just opened it and let it rest in his lap, his fingers tracing the edge of a page. The next morning, he found her in the barn, brushing down one of the heifers with her sleeves rolled and hair pinned back. She straightened when she saw him. You're up early, he said. Couldn't sleep. He stepped inside, the smell of hay and animals thick in the air. I meant to ask. That song you sang the other night. Where'd you learn it? My father used to hum it before going out to the fields. Said it helped him remember who he was. Owen leaned against the stall. You miss him? She nodded. Every day. You ever think about staying put? Kenzie turned to him fully now, eyes unreadable. That depends. On what? On whether someone wants me to. He stepped forward then, slowly, until he stood close enough to feel the warmth of her breath in the cold air. I do. Kenzie didn't answer right away. She didn't need to. She laid her hand over his, rough from years of fence wire and winter wind, and held it there. No rush. No promises spoken too soon. Just a hand, steady and sure. And outside, the snow began to soften under the pale light of a sky slowly turning toward spring. By mid-February, the snow finally began to melt in earnest, pulling back from the creek banks and revealing the brittle grass underneath. The land still carried winter in its bones, but the air had softened just enough for Owen to unbutton the top of his coat without freezing. The days stretched longer, and on the warmer afternoons, the children ventured farther past the yard, boots soaked through but laughing anyway. Kenzie had begun marking the pantry shelves with bits of chalk, taking stock of what they had and what they'd need come spring. She moved through the house with a quiet certainty now, not as a guest, not as someone passing through. The children followed her the way young things do when trust has taken root. One morning, Owen stepped into the kitchen to find her elbow deep in flour, sleeves rolled to the elbows, a thick braid falling over her shoulder. You ever make biscuits before? She asked, glancing his way without pausing her work. Only the kind you have to chew like bark, he answered, leaning against the doorframe. Well, she said, brushing a streak of flour from her cheek with the back of her wrist. These might be easier on the teeth. He watched her hands work the dough, the way she pressed and folded it with practiced care. You ever think of opening a place? Bakery, maybe? She shook her head. No. I don't like the idea of strangers coming and going. I like knowing who I'm feeding. Owen crossed the room, lifted a tin of lard from the counter, then set it down without opening it. You always that careful with your heart? Kenzie paused, fingers stilled in the dough. She looked up at him slowly, deliberately. Careful's the only way I've survived this long. Their eyes held for a moment too long for it to be ordinary. The next day, they hitched a wagon and rode out to the neighboring homestead. The Widmer family had a sick cow, and Owen had promised to take a look. Kenzie rode beside him, her skirts tucked under for modesty, her hands wrapped in wool that had seen better seasons. You always help folks around here? She asked as they jostled down the rutted trail. Only when they ask, he replied. Most don't. Why's that? They think I keep too much to myself. Don't like that I don't come to barn dances or Sunday socials. So why help now? He didn't answer right away. Then, because I know what it is to need someone and not know who to ask. Kenzie didn't speak after that. Just sat with her hands folded in her lap, the rhythm of the wagon filling the silence between them. At the Widmers, Owen worked in the barn, while Kenzie stayed inside with Mrs. Widmer, who was near to delivering her 5th child. When they left, the older woman pressed a sack of dried apples into Kenzie's arms. "You got a good way about you," she said, smoothing Kenzie's shawl. "You stay long enough, this land will keep you." Kenzie didn't speak on the ride home. Not until they were almost to the bend in the creek where the cottonwoods grew thick. "I never thought I'd belong anywhere again," she said, voice low. "I thought I was too tired to try." Owen looked over, his profile lit gold by the late sun. "You're not tired now?" "I'm tired," she said, "but it don't feel hopeless anymore." They didn't talk the rest of the way. When they reached the house, the children met them at the gate, cheeks flushed from the cold. Luke had scraped his knee, but Lydia had already wrapped it with a strip of old muslin. That night, Owen stepped into the barn well after dark. The mare was restless, shifting in her stall. He rubbed her neck, then leaned against the rail and looked out through the cracks in the boards at the stars. He prayed again, quiet, almost ashamed at how long it had taken him to find his way back. "Thank you," he whispered, "for second chances that don't look like I thought they would." Inside, Kenzie sat by the fire, mending the cuff of Luke's shirt. She paused, listening to the wind against the walls, then to the soft creak of the barn door closing. She didn't know what would come next. But she knew where she was. And that, for the first time in years, was enough. The first hard rain came in March, breaking the long hush of snow with a sound like spilled nails on the roof. The land turned soft and restless beneath it, and the creek behind the house ran high and fast, thick with meltwater. Owen stood by the barn doors with his hat pulled low, watching the sky darken as the wind picked up and tossed the trees like they were made of paper. Inside, Kenzie was laying oilcloth across the windowsills to keep the damp out. Luke sat cross-legged on the floor, tracing the edge of a woodcarving Owen had made the year before, and Lydia was curled near the stove with her head resting on a folded quilt. When Owen came in, he shrugged out of his coat and set it by the fire. Kenzie straightened from the hearth and dusted her hands on her apron. "Fence won't hold through another storm like this," he said. "I'll need to dig new posts once the ground softens." Kenzie reached for the kettle. "You'll need someone to hold the line while you dig." "I've got 2 good hands." He looked at her, noting the quiet resolve in her voice. "You ever dig fence post holes before?" "No," she said, pouring water into a tin cup. "But I've done harder things." He took the cup, their fingers brushing only briefly. "You don't have to prove anything, Kenzie." "I'm not," she said, looking steadily at him. "I just want to help build what I've been living in." Owen held her gaze for a moment, then nodded once and drank. That evening, after the children were asleep and the rain had eased to a thin, steady patter, Owen found her in the lean-to off the kitchen, hanging herbs to dry from a beam. She moved quietly, tying stems with twine as if she'd done it in this house for years. "You always keep busy like that?" he asked from the doorway. She didn't turn. "Work keeps my mind from wandering where it shouldn't." "You afraid of where it'll go?" Kenzie tied off another bundle and hung it beside the others. "Not afraid. Just not ready to chase down every old thought that's tried to outlive its usefulness." He stepped inside, the scent of sage and dried lavender crowding the narrow space. "You think some thoughts are meant to be buried?" "No," she said, finally facing him. "But I think some need to be weathered before they're worth speaking." Owen leaned against the post, folding his arms. "I never learned to talk about what I feel." "Not proper anyhow." Kenzie gave a small nod. "Then don't talk." "Show me." He didn't answer. Just stood there, the sound of rain ticking on the roof above them. The next morning, they worked side by side in the pasture. The ground was still half frozen, and the wind stung their faces as they dug. Kenzie's hands blistered before noon, but she didn't stop. Owen noticed, and without a word, wrapped strips of linen around her palms. She didn't thank him. She just nodded and kept digging. By the time the sun fell behind the trees, They'd set 4 posts and tamped them in tight. Kenzie leaned on her shovel, cheeks flushed, and looked out over the field. You think land remembers the people who stay? She asked. Owen wiped his brow with the back of his sleeve. I think it remembers who tended it. That night, as they sat on the porch steps with a blanket over their laps, the children asleep inside, Kenzie turned to him. You ever think about what comes next? Owen didn't look at her. Just watched the stars blink into being above the trees. I used to think the future died with Mary. Now I'm not so sure. Kenzie rested her hand on his, light as breath. I'm not asking for promises. He turned then, and for the first time, let the weight in his chest ease just enough to speak what had been gathering for weeks. I don't want you to leave when the weather clears. She didn't smile. Didn't cry. Just let out a long, quiet breath and leaned her head against his shoulder. I don't want either. They sat that way until the moon rose high and the cold pushed them gently back inside. In the days that followed, the land bloomed slow and stubborn under a pale sun. Seedlings pushed through the thawed soil, and the chickens began laying again. Owen built a new gate for the back pasture, and Kenzie taught Lydia how to stitch a straight seam without puckering the fabric. One afternoon, while Luke napped and Lydia read aloud from a worn book, Kenzie stood beside Owen at the edge of the field, watching the wind move through the grass. I used to think faith was something you carried, she said. Like a satchel or a book. Something you had to hold tight or it'd slip away. Owen looked at her, the way her hair caught the light, the way her voice stayed steady. And now? She turned toward him. Now I think it's something that rises up again when you least expect it. Like spring. He reached for her hand, calloused and wrapped in sun-warmed linen. You brought it back to me without even trying. She didn't answer. Just stepped closer, and let her forehead rest lightly against his. They stood like that a long while, the wind moving around them, the earth soft beneath their boots, and the future unfolding like a prayer neither of them thought they'd ever speak again. By early April, the first wild irises bloomed in the low ditch behind the barn, their petals trembling in the breeze like something too soft for this world. The ground had dried enough for planting, and Owen spent long hours in the field behind the house, turning the soil with Lydia trailing close behind, asking questions about roots and rows, her hands perpetually smudged with dirt. Kenzie worked in the kitchen with Luke perched on a stool beside her, shelling peas with the kind of focus only 6-year-olds could summon. She had begun keeping a small notebook tucked behind the flour sack, where she wrote down seed tallies and baking measurements and, once, a line of verse she wouldn't let Lydia peek at. That evening, after the children were put to bed and the last of the dishes stacked neatly to dry, Owen found her in the yard, sitting on the edge of the rain barrel with her boots in the grass and her braid loosened down her back. I saw a pair of sandhill cranes today, she said without turning. Down near the creek. He stepped closer, arms folded across his chest, and said nothing. They mate for life, you know. One dies, the other stays alone. Seems a lonely way to go, he said, voice low. She looked up at him then, moonlight soft on her face. It's loyal. He watched her for a long moment. You think loyalty and loneliness always go hand in hand? I used to, she answered. But I don't anymore. He crouched beside her, hand brushing hers as he reached into the grass for a smooth stone. I'm not a man who speaks pretty. You know that. I'm not asking for words, she said. I'm asking for truth. He turned the stone in his palm. Truth is, I didn't think I'd feel anything like this again. Not after Mary. I didn't think I'd want to. Kenzie's fingers closed over his. And now? Now I wake up and hope you're still here. She leaned into him, her shoulder warm against his. I'm not going anywhere. The next Sunday, Lydia asked if they could go into Missoula for church. Owen hesitated, then agreed. They hitched the wagon early, dressed in their best, Kenzie in a borrowed dress cinched tight at the waist, her hair pinned up in a way that made Owen's chest ache a little with quiet admiration. The church was small, tucked between a dry goods store and a boarding house. Inside, the pews were rough-hewn and the hymns carried on without accompaniment. Kenzie sang softly beside him, her voice steady but not showy. Owen didn't sing. But he stayed seated beside her, his boot brushing hers beneath the bench, and that was enough. After the benediction, a woman with silver hair and a wide-brimmed bonnet approached, her gaze flicking between Owen and Kenzie. "We've missed you," she said, not unkindly. "The children have grown." Owen offered a polite nod. "Been tending what's mine." The woman's eyes lingered on Kenzie. "You're new." Kenzie smiled, polite and sure. "Kenzie Novak. I'm helping on the ranch." The woman sniffed slightly. "Well, you're welcome here, of course." As they walked back toward the wagon, Owen glanced at Kenzie. "That bother you?" "Not in the least," she said. "I didn't come here to fit in. I came here to stay." That night, after the children were asleep and the wind had picked up across the field, Owen lit a lantern and stepped out to the front porch. Kenzie followed, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. "I've been thinking," he said, watching the flame flicker behind the glass. "This house, it's been standing near 10 years. Never had a name." Kenzie looked out over the field, her breath misting. "What would you call it?" He turned to her. "That's the thing. I want you to name it." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Ash Grove." "Why?" "There were ash trees behind our house growing up. They bent in windstorms but never broke. My father said they were a sign of strength that didn't shout." Owen nodded. "Ash Grove it is." The next morning, he climbed the ladder and nailed a wooden sign above the porch beam. The letters were carved cleanly, Ash Grove. Kenzie watched from the path, her hand resting on the gate. She didn't say anything. Just smiled, and he smiled back, the kind that settled deep and stayed. By late spring, the garden behind the house had taken root. Kenzie planted chamomile near the porch, and Owen built her a bench from old barn wood. She sat there in the evenings, mending or writing in her little notebook, and sometimes just watching the sky darken slow and steady with Owen beside her, boots laced and quiet. One evening, as the sun dipped low and turned the clouds the color of ripe peaches, Owen reached for her hand. "I want to marry you," he said simply. "If you'll have me." Kenzie looked down at their joined hands, then back up at him. "I will." They married beneath the cottonwood by the creek, the same tree where Mary was buried. Lydia wore a crown of wildflowers and Luke carried a Bible too large for his hands. The preacher spoke plain and short, and Owen's voice didn't shake when he said yes. Afterward, they shared blackberry pie and black coffee with the neighbors who came. No music, no dancing, just quiet talk and full plates and a feeling like something long overdue finally settling into place. That night, after the guests had gone and the children were asleep, Owen and Kenzie sat on the porch beneath a sky full of stars. "You sure about this?" he asked, his voice barely louder than the wind. Kenzie leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. "There's no one else I'd rather build a life with." He kissed her then, slow and certain, and she kissed him back, her hands resting over his heart. And there, beneath the sign that read Ash Grove, with the scent of chamomile rising warm into the night, they began the rest of their life. Years later, the house still stood. The fields grew strong under their care. Owen taught Luke how to build gates and read weather from the sky. Kenzie taught Lydia how to preserve herbs and write letters that told the truth. And when the wind bent the ash trees behind the barn, they stood in the doorway together and watched them sway, knowing they'd hold. They always did.